Well, hello and welcome to the November 5th, 2023 online sermon from Christian Fellowship Church. Christian Fellowship Church is located in Northwest Indiana. Our contact information is at the end of this video. Please use it to come to one of our services, one of our activities, and especially on November 19th when we're having our Thanksgiving outreach, Thanksgiving dinner. And I think it's about the 17th, 18th year that we've been doing this, where we offer a free Thanksgiving dinner to the community, and we do it right after the morning service. It usually goes from about noon to 2. And so we'd love for you to participate, come to the service, and then enjoy a blessed meal. For those of you who regularly attend Christian Fellowship Church, start praying now for the impact of this outreach. We're going to transition into the music ministry, and then we're going to come back and have your Bibles ready. Esther chapter 4. Anguish, intense pain, intense anguish. I don't believe you can be on this planet for very long without experiencing some type of intense pain, some type of anguish, some type of tragedy. Tragedy, I believe, strikes us all. And when tragedy strikes you, and it's a bad situation, you do get anguish. And so when tragedy strikes, how do you react? How have you reacted? We've all gotten bad news, and I want you to think about it. Maybe even tomorrow, today, meditate on it. The following stories that I'm going to tell are all about me. But for all that, especially who are adults, I think who have lived long enough, that you can relate, I believe every one of these are stories not just about me, but stories that you have gone through. First, I can remember the very first time I experienced death. And I think every one of us can think about that, because when we think of tragedies, often death is the very first thing that we think of. And when somebody dies, that is usually one of the hardest things we have to deal with. And surprise death, when it's unexpected, is very hard. And that happened to me on March 18th, 1968, when I was about 6 years old, where my grandfather died. And I've shared that story before. And initially it didn't impact me, but then it did. And that was how I initially, as a young person, sometimes you don't grasp the significance of a tragedy. But then I had the anguish at night, and I cried myself to sleep. So I ask you, where were you the first time that you had to deal with the death of someone? The second biggest anguish of my life dealt with the death of my mother. But she died on January 27, 1982. But that wasn't the hardest day. The hardest dealing with her death, the most anguish, dealt years before. And for us who get the news that someone in our family is dying, the process becomes that announcement of something that is bringing us anguish and pain. And we die 100 deaths. We die, I use the expression, we die 1,000 deaths. And that's exactly what happened to me. I was 20 years old when my mother died, but the real pain came when I was 18 and her health started to decline. And there's two vivid accounts that I have. First, when I was about 18, soon as we started to get news that her health was significantly declining, I had to drive her to the Cleveland Clinic from Youngstown, Ohio to Cleveland. It was about an hour and a half drive, and it's a massive medical facility. And for whatever reason, my mother just wanted me to drop her off and then just to wait for her. And that's exactly what I did. She comes out after like a 2-hour visit with the doctor. And when she gets in the car, she tells me, and really cries, telling me that the doctor has just told her that she's going to go blind. And that was a lot of pain for me. I had watched my mother read 1-2 books a week ever since I could remember, and she was going to go blind. We eventually had to get her books on tape, but that memory was a memory of anguish and pain, and it was numbing for me. And then about 2 years later, prior to her, right before she did die, I met with her doctor, and it was during the break between fall semester at college for me and winter semester. And my mother had been in and out of comas, and I didn't know whether to go back to school or not, knowing that she could die at any time. And I just remember meeting with him and him telling me that her death could not come for a long time, like another 6 months or something. So he suggested going back to school. But the reality of it and the clarity of the nearness that it was going to eventually occur, most likely within the year, was very, very numbing. Bad news, pain, anguish. So when my mother did die on January 27, 1982, she had already died 1,000 times for me. And dealing with that numbness and that pain. And I am sure that you can all remember when maybe a parent died or somebody told you that they were going to die, and how you went through the anguish and the pain. And then when my brother died on November 4th, and the Saturday is the anniversary of it, but he died November 4th, 2010, incredibly, it's been 13 years. His death was also after 1,000 tears, 1,000 times of crying, because it was in 2005 that he got sick and we were told that he was going to die. And so, he died of cancer, from lung cancer that metastasized in his brain. And the reality of it is, when you deal with news that somebody's got cancer, somebody's got something that's going to bring about their death, then those are very, very helpless feelings. And you feel like, what can I do? What can I do other than feel the pain? And again, we may not always talk about it, but it brings a lot of tears. And there's other situations out there. I could have brought in breaking up with a girlfriend. That was always difficult, especially in some of you have dealt with marriages that have broken up. And for me, whether it's dealing with problems sometimes at the church, dealing with children, and the pain. And in the Bible, God has one man go through some of the most intense pain ever. The man we know, Job. And I'd encourage you to read the story of Job, because his loss of his children, his loss of his wealth, and then the loss of his health, and then a very negative wife causes him to sit with his friends who come to see him in silence. How did he react? Silence. Silence conveyed an incredible, intense pain. Think about that. And that's why I want to have you ponder about how you've reacted different ways, that you've even seen people act. So what do you do when you get bad news? Do you think God knows your anguish? And that's what I've been trying to talk about with the invisible hand of God, in the visible presence of God. I believe absolutely. And the psalmist reflected. I don't know if you went and looked at it last week, but I did quote Psalm 42 that ends with this: "Why are you in despair, O my soul?" Well, the idea of being despair, that's intense anguish, being low. So why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my countenance and my God. The psalmist is crying out to God and letting God know that he's trusting in God. So what I want us to do today is to look at Esther chapter 4. If you'll turn your Bibles to Esther chapter 4, and you will see, as we come to this story, a group of people in anguish, and we're going to see how they reacted to it. So if you'll turn there, let me just quickly recap chapter 1 through 3. Chapter 1, we see this king who is at the center of our story, King Ahasuerus, and he gets rid of his queen. Chapter 2, Esther, our heroine in the story, becomes queen through a very vile contest. And then third, Hammond comes on the scene. He is our evil person. He's the evil person in this story, the book of Esther. And so we know that from chapter 3, Hammond is put into a plot, into plan, an act to have a Holocaust. He wants to wipe out the Jewish people. And we think there's maybe 12 to 15 million people on the scene. And I'm just going to walk through this story. I've sent out sermon notes to our church. For you who are watching this video and you're maybe not regular attender of Christian Fellowship Church, know if you email the church, I will send these sermon notes out to you. And I had fill in the blank to stress something as we tell the story. In the very first act, if you would, is how the news of the impending Holocaust causes intense mourning. And the key word there is intense, something that's high level. And we're going to see how Mordecai, the cousin to Esther, reacts. So we pick up verse 1. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. Now, is that intense? I mean, there are times when I want to celebrate a football game or something, I'll go out and I'll scream. I always scream so some of my neighbors can hear me, just for fun, okay? But I'll tell you, this is maybe what we saw recently with Israel and with the attack by Hamas. or some of the people realizing some of the horrors that happened, where they would just feel this incredible pain. We don't see people putting on sackcloth and ashes. Sackcloth is a very harsh kind of material, and it would make you feel very uncomfortable. It's a way to visually let people know that you are hurting. And I want to communicate, we don't have that today, but I'm going to reiterate this again later, that we sometimes have people who don't want to act as if something is really bothering them. And it's like they're not honest. Mordecai is incredibly honest. He tears his clothes. In a day and age when people don't have a lot of clothes in the closet, it's pretty significant that he did that. And by going out into the middle of the city and crying, he is drawing attention to himself. He's letting people know. So verse 2, he went far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And that is, if I can digress, as we historically look through the book of Esther, we learn about the culture in which this story was set. It is just a good reminder to us of how the kings were very elite, and they didn't want to deal with unhappiness. And nobody that was unhappy was really to come into their little utopia. They had their courtyard. They were to live a life just oblivious to the realities of normal everyday pain and suffering. Obviously very selfish, very self-oriented, but that's why he's only allowed to go so far. And then verse 3, in each and every province where the command and the decree of the king came, there was great mourning amongst the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many laying on sackcloth and ashes. So similar, doing the same thing. The ashes would be broken up. It is almost like burnt city, right? It's like things are burned. It's been, it's just been totally destroyed. So incredible intensity. And Mordecai might have felt more of the responsibility as well because of the reality of the decree, because now he knows that this is all tied to Hammond being upset with him for not bowing down. So he knows that he had a part in causing it. And then he also knows the irrevocable stupidity of the Persian laws. That's something we've talked about from chapter 1, where they had a law that once it's put in effect, it couldn't be reversed, which was idiotic. And we're going to see, you're going to have to stay with us in this story to see how that gets dealt with. But yeah, sackcloth and ashes were an outward sign of inward distress. It's used throughout the Bible, Jeremiah, Daniel, also in Matthew. And so it was a reality that people all over the place were feeling this intense pain. And so as we work through the story then, we have great mourning all over. And so then we're going to learn how Esther learns about the decree from Mordecai with a response of intense anguish. So we'll pick up as we see in verse 4. It says, then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her. So the maidens and the eunuchs are the people who are working under her. And the queen writhed in great anguish. So fill in the blank with intense anguish. So the idea here is that she now realizes, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth for him, but he did not accept him. What she's doing is put clothes on so he can come, because there are rules, and these rules have to be followed. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend to her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and what it was. So obviously this is somebody that she can trust. All right, and so he goes out, and Mordecai, verse 7, tells him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasury for the destruction of the Jews. So she basically gets the whole full story, and he also gave him a text of the edict, which had been issued in Susa for the destruction. Okay, well, I jumped ahead. So basically what you have here is Esther, without even knowing the details, what caused this is what is, her inquiries dealing with. That would be like similar to maybe, somebody comes and says, so-and-so died in your family, and you don't know why, and now how? Well, they were in a car accident, they were shot, or something like that. So that's really what's going on here, and so we can all relate. We've gotten bad news. We don't have to have all the details at first, right? We don't have to have those details, but we get the bad news, we react, and then we want to find out the details. That's what's going on in this second section here. And so as we work through this, then we come to the next section of the story as the next act plays out. And what we have is Mordecai now requests Esther to intensely plead with the king to stop all of this. He wants a solution, and he wants help, and it's not small. So verse 8, he also gave him a copy of the text. So he gives Hathach the edict. So I digress. The reality of verse 8, the very fact that Mordecai has this edict shows that he was somebody of position within the community. Because I don't think, the commentary said that the average person wouldn't have had this edict in hand. So he gives him an edict of the text which had been issued in Susa for the destruction. Then he might show Esther and inform her in order for her to go into the king to implore his favor. There's that key word, implore. That's an English word, the same in Hebrew, to intensely ask somebody something, his favor, and to plead with him for her people. And again, remember the climate in the Persian community at this time is very anti-Jew. And we go to Ezra chapter 4 to see that. That's why she's keeping her background, I believe, silent. And so Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. So the idea is, you're in this position, you can do something, help. Because the reality of it is, they're not dead yet. And so Esther now comes back in the story and lets Mordecai know his request could get her killed, because this is a life and death matter. And that's the theme of this chapter. The intensity of life and death plays out. And not only are the Jews potentially going to get killed, but she could get killed, and let's learn why. So Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. Listen, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to the king for these 30 days. So again, digression, background. As I alluded earlier, the kings of this day don't want to have any discomfort. They want to live in this utopia, and they want to see people whenever they want to see them. But also the thought is too, they don't want anyone that could potentially come in and assassinate them. Eventually, this king, we know historically, gets assassinated by two of his sons, play a role in getting him killed so that one of the sons can become king. And so, this is something that isn't to be played with. And this man's already dealt with one attempted killing, assassination of him that we saw in chapter 2, where Mordecai thwarted it. And so that's part and parcel of it. So bottom line is that Esther's saying, I can't come because unless he holds out the golden scepter, I'm going to die. And so there's the risk. Do I go in without being asked? And so verse 12, they related Esther's words to Mordecai. So the story is building, and we're realizing what's going in. And at this point, Esther isn't saying that she isn't going to go. She, to me, has just said, look, do you understand what's at stake? Do you understand I could get myself killed? And I don't know where we could relate to something like that. Maybe if we, right now, if I said to you, look, I need you to go fly into Gaza and get a message to somebody. I need you to go there. I need you to do something right now. I've got a plane ticket for you to leave this afternoon, go on to Gaza, where you're in the middle of the war. You say, wait a second, I could get killed. But no, you need to do that. You need to do that. Let's say we had medicine. Maybe there was a sick child there, and you needed to get medicine to that child. You say, well, listen, I realize the situation. The child needs the medicine, but I can get killed. So, is that a hesitancy to go? In some cases, it could be. In others, it could just be that, look, I've got to really, we got to play this out. You got to think this through. Well, this is when we come next to the next section of verses, is the most famous verse in all of the book of Esther, and rightfully so. And it is where Mordecai's famous reply that lets Esther know that she cannot escape death. That's the key, because we're dealing with a life and death issue in this situation. And he implies that she is to think about God's invisible hand in this. Watch this. Then Mordecai, verse 13, told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can take any more than all the Jews. So don't think that you're going to get away, because maybe when they find out, remember, these irrevocable laws will mandate that you're killed too. And so he says, verse 14, and this is the famous verse, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. Where's it getting at? Well, as we've already talked about, God has made eternal promises to the Jews that they will not be wiped out in a Holocaust. People could try and cause a lot of deaths, and we know Hitler will, and we know the Antichrist is going to kill a lot of Jews, but they're never going to win. And so eventually relief is going to come. But he said, so that's what I believe. This is why I said there's this aspect of the invisible hand. He believes that God is working always to protect the Jews. But here's the challenge. Relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. Because if she dies, boom. So, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And there's the challenge. Is God's hand sovereignly put you in this place? And from their perspective, I can think you can honestly think, yeah, I think so. We don't see a note from God, hey, I've put you here for this reason. There's a sense where when you're in a situation and all of a sudden you have the opportunity to do the right thing, it's because I believe if you're a Christian and we believe all things work together for good, that you are there to do what God wanted. And so, let's talk about like in the doctrine of election, because maybe that's akin to the reality that Israel is the elect nation. Well, you can say, I'm working with this coworker and I feel like there's an opportunity for me to witness, but I don't know if I would. Maybe he is somebody that's going to quit if I witness, or maybe he's going to fire me if I witness them. So I'm just going to keep myself silent. Well, I think it'd be a fair thing to say, look, we've all been told to share the gospel, and that person, if you're truly elected, is going to get saved. However, wouldn't you like the blessing and the reward for being the person that does it? So don't shut up right now. Say something. And so to me, this is a great challenge. I think it would still be applicable to us. And it is just a great reminder that God is sovereignly putting his people in place for different works. And that's why we go back to Romans 8. All things work together for good for those who love Christ Jesus, right? And that things are working out in our lives always. And that invisible hand is moving and shaping and directing our lives. Well, how does Esther react? Well, Esther puts her life on the line, bathed in prayer. And again, pick up in verse 15. It says, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther commanded him. Basically, Esther's going for it. Esther is saying, hey, I'm going to do this, and if I die, I die. And this is a very brave woman. And what we've got to see, the concept of fasting is, I think, an absolutely ingenious way of bringing God into the story. Remember, the book of Esther never mentions God by name one time. But the idea of fasting is very much akin to prayer. And it is where you deny yourself of food or water in this situation. Every time you're thinking of food or you're thinking of water or you're feeling weak, you're to be thinking of God, thinking of your commitment. It's a forced way to get you to do that. Now, there are no commands in the Old Testament nor in the New Testament to talk about fasting, but it is something that is understood. This is something that people do in relation to God, the invisible God, the God who is there. And so all I can say is that Esther is all in. And Esther is bathing this, I believe, in prayer. She's not just rushing in right away. She's saying, I'm praying. And I think that this is a humbling challenge to all of us to look and see what's being modeled here. That when you have a situation, we got to go to prayer. And I would ask you to think about that as you challenge yourself regarding how you react in tragedy. Now, tragedies come all the time, and things in life are just not fair. And I got to tell you a very interesting illustration, and you think where this is going. A very, very interesting illustration. It's about a man named William Whiting Borden. And I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was a man who lived back in the early 1900s, and he came from a millionaire family, like maybe billionaire family in today's age, and wasn't tied to the milk company, but he was a man who basically had it all. And his story is fascinating because it deals with tragedy, and what I want to deal with is the reaction to the tragedy. You may not know him. He was educated at Yale University, and his parents sent him on a year-long trip around the world as a graduation present. Early in his life, he had come to Christ. His mother had come to Christ. I think it was in 1894. Guess where? Here in Chicago at Moody Church. And he had come to Christ, and while traveling the world, something happened that no one expected. He was moved by the spiritual and physical needs of people around the world. He wrote a letter to his parents, informed that he wanted to spend his life as a missionary. And one of his friends remarked that becoming a missionary would be tantamount to throwing one's life away. Upon his return, Borden went to Yale and graduated. He then studied and graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary, and when his ministry preparation was completed, he boarded a ship to Asia to serve among Muslims in China's Gansu province. Along the way, he stopped in Cairo to learn Arabic and study Islam. In Egypt, Borden contracted spinal meningitis, and then he died. We said, wait a second. I thought you were going to tell us a story about him being a missionary and all the great things he did. No, he dies. What I'm talking to you about is reaction to tragedy. And the reaction to tragedy for people who knew him and loved him is what is the amazing thing in this story. Because what happened is that basically, because of him, missionary work exploded and more people became missionaries because of him. And basically, young men and women read Borden's story in the newspapers of America and inspired them to leave all they had and gave their lives to reach the nations with the gospel of Christ. And I don't have a full number, but it is one of the most interesting stories on how you react to tragedy. And I just think instead of like getting bitter, you get better, get closer. Because the people who loved and the people who were thinking, wow, God will always protect, sometimes it doesn't happen. Because these people who went off, they could have faced the same tragedy. So if I was going to give application today, and that's what I would like to do, is I would like you to learn from this story from Esther. Number one, be honest about pain. I think you have the sackcloth, you have the ashes, you have the crying, the wailing. I have seen it's happened too often that people aren't honest. What are you going through? Oh, nothing. So wait a second. It's a tragedy, whether it's death, disease, problems, abandonment. We need to be honest about our pain. And I think that even again carries into our prayer life. God, this really hurts. There is nothing wrong with expressing pain. For us who are believers, we know we're going to heaven. But let's be honest when you go through a tough time. Do not lie. And I thought about it. It was ironic. Somebody asked me this week how I was doing. A couple of people have, and I had a tough week. And one of the things I try to tell people all the time, honestly, it's hard. I mean, sometimes I feel like crying. Sometimes I feel like not getting out of bed. Maybe if we are all honest with people more, we would help people. You want to encourage people. Be honest and tell them what you're going through. And maybe you also get more people praying for you. Second, consider fasting. It is something to consider because it is something you see that is patterned in the Old Testament, New Testament, and we've talked about it before. Maybe you have to check out with your medical doctor if you should do it. You know your own body. You know what you can do, what you can't do, and sometimes it's going to push you. And so I'm not advocating anybody do it without getting medically tested if you have any concerns. But you can do it without food. You can do water, however you want to do it. But it's not Lent, people. This is far different than the Catholic Lent. So fasting is something that's not commanded, yet modeled in the Old Testament and New Testament. And to me, it's tied to prayer. And I'd say be wise. But when you do it, be wise if you can medically do it. But if you do it, you're focused on God. All right? And then third, I do advocate, I think this chapter is showing us prayer. I don't think people pray without fasting. I think it's implied here. You can try to argue me that I'm wrong, but I'm going to hold fast that I think Esther was praying, Mordecai was praying, the other Jews were praying because they believe that in intense times, hear my prayer, O God. Why are you in despair, O my soul? Right? And it's like hoping God, and that is something that we do. I can't guarantee that everyone's going to live, everything's going to work out. Maybe prayer for you will just sustain you, but in many situations, sometimes prayer does change things. And so pray. My admonition to you is pray. Spend time in prayer. So the reality of it is anguish does come in this world, and I can't stop it for any of you. That is why you're all going to deal with bad news. And how do you deal with it? And you're going to deal with the death of someone. You're going to deal with somebody maybe getting divorced, somebody abandoning you, some accident that occurred, some loss of finances. Listen, the Jews who were in Persia at this time faced a Holocaust. And they were honest about the pain. They fasted. They prayed. And I think you can too. And all of this was all willing to be sold out and committed to God. They, as Esther modeled it, she trusted God even if she was going to die. She was going to act on it. And on Sunday, we're going to go into communion. And the reality is we're going to relate it to Jesus, who from a human side trusted God the Father, knowing that I needed to do whatever it took, even if it meant dying on a cross. And that's what we proclaim today as believers of Jesus Christ, that he did die on that cross. But he trusted God the Father to raise him from the tomb, and he did. And now today, as according to the Bible, as the Bible says, even if you die, you can live. Jesus said, I am the resurrection of life. Even if you die, you shall live. That's in John chapter 11. I would hope that you would believe it. And then I would hope that you would live it out.